If you have been programming in JavaScript, then chances are you must have worked with Angular or some other framework which provides MVC or Model View Controller support. Have you ever thought how the most popular JavaScript MVC frameworks work? In this video, I will create a very small plugin which will have capabilities to set view model using controller functions and then use those models in views. Also, the views will be switched when the URL will be changed in the browser's address bar. All of this will happen in a single page application, which means that there will not be navigation to other HTML pages to switch views. So let's get started with this video to create our own small JavaScript MVC framework plugin. Before we actually start to code, I want to show you the finished product. So this is an HTML page and it contains some navigation links over here, and this is the view container, which is essentially a div. Whenever we will click on any of these links, then the view will be switched to the HTML contents which are related to the link which we have clicked. So for example, this is the default view which is for the home, and when I will click on contact, then the view will be switched and another HTML content will be placed inside the view container. When I will click on about, then a different view HTML will be rendered. Now you can also see that when I am clicking on these links, then the hash value in the browser's address bar is also being changed, because these links are actually navigating to these URLs. So what happens is the view is not actually switching when the link is being clicked. It is actually switching when the hash value in the browser's address bar is being changed. So for example, if instead of clicking this contact link, if I will simply type contact over here, and when I will press enter, then the view will be switched. So this is pretty awesome stuff because we don't really need to click on anything. The plugin code is simply detecting the changes in the browser's hash value, and based on that it is serving the appropriate view HTML which is relevant to the name of the root which is inside the hash value. Also, you can see that there are these values for first name, last name, phone number, etc. These are the model properties which have been set inside the controller functions. So what is happening is the view HTML has the tokens for first name, last name and phone number. The controller function is providing the properties and the values for those tokens, and the plugin is simply replacing the tokens with the property values which are matching with the token names. This is the HTML file which I just showed you. Here is the reference to the JavaScript file mvc.js, which is our small MVC plugin. These are the navigation links, and you can see that they are navigating to their respective hash URLs, and the hash values are actually the root names which are getting activated whenever these links are being clicked. This div is acting as a view container and it has an attribute view. So the plugin, when it started, will actually look for elements with the view attribute, and it will then start to use the first element which it will find as a view container. This is the actual code for our small MVC plugin. The first things which are being done over here is the root information is being added. The root information basically consists of three values. The first one is the controller function which is being used to set model properties. As you can see, in home controller, the model is being sent as an argument and properties are being attached to the model. So the message property has the value hello world. In the case of contact controller, the first name, last name and phone properties are being attached to the model object with their values. The next thing is the name of the root with which these controller functions are associated, and finally the path of the view HTML file from where the view HTML is being fetched. So the view HTML is not residing in this index.html. The plugin code will pick the view HTML from an external HTML file to make it easier to manage all of the files and contents. And then finally the initialize function is being called to start up the MVC plugin so that it can pick up the hash changes and serve the appropriate view depending on the value of the root which is inside the hash value. I will also show you the view HTML file from where the view HTML is being fetched. For example, if we want to see the contact HTML, then we can navigate to this contact.html, and you can see that these are the contents which are being served in the view container whenever the contact root is activated. These are the tokens which have names, and these names match the properties which are being attached to the model object in the controller function for the contact root. When the view will be rendered, then these tokens will be replaced with the property values. If no property is found in the model which is matching this token name or any of these token names, then these tokens will not be replaced and they will render as they are. So now let's start to code our small JavaScript MVC plugin. Also, I want to tell you that this plugin will not be using any external third-party library. It will be self-sufficient on its own, so it can be used as it is. Also, if you don't want to watch this video and just want to see the finished product, then you can do that by going to the description of this video. There are links to the source code which you can download or clone as per your leisure or requirements, but I highly recommend to watch this video so that you can understand how this entire thing is actually working. Now the first thing that I will do is create a new JavaScript file and let's name it mvc1.js. Before I begin, I want to list out the steps which we will be following to create this plugin. The first one is to add the root information. The second one is to create an UpdateView function, and then we will need to call this function whenever the hash value in the browser's address bar will be changed. So wire up the UpdateView function with hash changes. When we have detected the hash change and when we have fetched the name of the root from the hash, then what we need to do is we need to fetch the view HTML from the external HTML file. So fetch the view HTML, and then we will need to process the view HTML. But before we do that, we will need to call the controller function associated with the root. So call the controller function, and then we need to actually replace the tokens. When all of this has been done, then render the view HTML in the view container. So these are more or less the crude steps which we are going to follow, but things are not really that simple. We will need to create several different functions for all of these things. So first what I will do is I will create a self-executing anonymous function which will have a separate scope, and this function is going to have two arguments for the window and document. And what we can do is we can supply these arguments when we are calling this self-executing function, so window and document. If you want, you can also place semicolons or semicolon in the beginning, just to be sure that if there is any previous script loaded before this one which doesn't have an ending semicolon, then we are providing one so that the code will not crash when it is minified or compiled. Okay, so first I am going to create the variables to hold the reference for the view element. Along with, we will also need a default root. If no root information is available in the browser's address bar, then we will have to revert back to a default root, because we must show a view if none of the root information is provided, right? And there is another flag we need which will indicate if the view has been already rendered or not. So this is for the reference of the view element. This is to hold the default root, and underscore rendered will tell us if the view has already been rendered or not. After this, I will create a constructor function for our small MVC plugin. Let's call it JS MVC, and let's create the function. So this constructor function will be used to create an object for this plugin. Now in this constructor function, we will need the object to hold the root information, and for that I'm going to create an object which will be called underscore root map, and let's initialize it as an empty object with no properties. So the root information will be added to this root map in a way that the root map will have properties, and each property will indicate a root The name of the property will be the name of the root, and the root itself is going to be an object which will have the information for the controller function and for the path of the root HTML. So we will need to create a constructor function for that root object as well. So this is the root object, and this constructor function is accepting 3 arguments: the controller, the root name, and the template path. And to be able to provide the feature to the user to add the roots, we will need to create a new function, and let's call it add root. So JS MVC dot prototype dot add root equals to function. Now this function is going to accept 3 arguments: the value of the controller function, the root name, and the template path for the view HTML. And inside it we are just going to add the root as a new property in this root map object like this. So the root object is being created using its controller function. Now it's time to create the initialize function, which will be used to initialize this plugin so that it can start working. And to do that, let's just create a new function. Initialize equals to function, and that's it. Now we need to do some things in this initialize function, so I'm just going to list the steps first. The first thing which we will need to do is to create a delegate to the UpdateView function. The UpdateView delegate will be wired up with the hash change event, so it will be called whenever the hash will change, and it will update the view associated with the root information provided in the hash value. So the first one is create the UpdateView delegate, and then we will need to get the view element reference. We will also need to set a default root when the browser's address bar does not have any root information. After this, we will wire up the hash change event with the UpdateView delegate. And then finally, we will need to call the UpdateView delegate to get things started. So call the UpdateView delegate. Now, before we begin to code this function, let's just create an empty UpdateView function. So function UpdateView, this is going to be an empty one. Now, the first thing is to create the delegate, and it is pretty easy. What we will do is we will create a new variable, and let's just call it UpdateView delegate equals to UpdateView dot bind. So a delegate always has a fixed context on which it can work, so we are going to provide this means this entire JS MVC object. So we are passing this object as the scope value for this UpdateView function. If you don't know what scopes for functions means, what happens is when this UpdateView function will be called, then whenever we will invoke this keyword, then this keyword will always point out to the argument value which we are supplying over here, and in this case this is pointing to JS MVC. So we are essentially providing this object as the scope value for this function, and bind will always return a function which will have a fixed scope. It can never be changed. It doesn't matter from where it is called. Let's now get the reference for the view element, and it can be done by calling document.querySelector and then providing the attribute value which we expect to be there. Now if no view element is found, then we will simply return from it and will do nothing, because without a view element we can not render anything. It's time to set a default root. So the default root will be the first root which is added to the root map object by using this add root function, and we can simply do that by fetching all of the properties which are inside this root map and then using the first one to be used as a default root like this. It can be done by using the object.getOwnPropertyNames and then providing the object whose properties we need to fetch as an argument, and then we will fetch the first one, and then the name of the property will be returned. So we will fetch the object which is associated with that property name, and then we will set that object as a default root. In this case, the home root is being added as the first one, so this is going to be used as a default root. Now the next thing is to wire up the hash change event with the UpdateView delegate, and it is pretty simple. What we will need to do is we need to call window.onHashChange, and then we will set the UpdateView delegate so that this function, this delegate function, will always be called whenever the hash value will be changed. Now finally we will call this UpdateView function to get things started. So we are pretty much done with this initialize function. Now it's time to create the UpdateView function, but similar to what we did for initialize, we are going to list out the steps which we need to perform. The first thing is to get the root name from the hash. So get the root name from the address bar hash, and then fetch the root object using the root name, and then if the root name is not found in the hash, then we will just use the default root. So if the root name is not found, then use default root. Finally, we will need to render the view HTML associated with the root. So for the first step, we will simply get the Windows hash value, but we will also need a couple of other variables, the root name and the root object. So the page hash value can be fetched by accessing the Windows location object's hash value, and then we will replace the hash symbol, because what will happen is the hash property is going to return this entire thing, the hash and then / and then contact. So to fetch the root name, what we will do is we will remove this hash and / and then we will use this value as a root name. We are replacing hash with an empty string. And now to get the root name, what we need to do is we need to remove the / from the page hash value as well, and this is going to be the root name. So before actually we fetch the root object, let's just also set the rendered flag to false, because if the update view has been called, then we are going to render a new view. To fetch the root object using the root name, we will simply use the _root map object. To do that, we will provide the root name as the name of the property, and then the root map will return the object, the root object associated with this property name. But if the root object is not returned, it will simply mean that the root name provided in the browser's address bar is not available. In that case, what we will do is we will revert back to the default root. So if the root object is undefined, then it will evaluate to false. And what we will do is we will set the root object as the default root, and this needs to be over here. Now the final thing for this method that we need to do is to render the view HTML associated with the root. But to do that, we will need to fetch the view HTML, and for that we will need another function, and let's call it LoadTemplate. Now this LoadTemplate will need some arguments to work with. The first one will be the root object, and the second one will be the view element. Alright, so the LoadTemplate will use the XML HTTP request object of the window to asynchronously fetch the view HTML from the template HTML file. Now this code is pretty basic. What we will do is we will create a new XHR or XML HTTP request object for this browser, and then we will use it to access the HTML contents. If you don't know how XHR works, then you can simply do a normal Google search, and there are tons of articles available to help you get started with the XHR object. The important thing is very few people actually use it, because there are so many libraries available out there which have provided their own implementations to fetch external resources from the network or from the file system. So this is the XML HTTP variable which will hold the reference for this XHR object. For modern browsers, we will simply create a new object out of its constructor function, but for older browsers like IE6 and IE5, we need to do something different to initialize this object, although I'm not really sure if many people are still using these browser versions, but you never know. So you have to keep in mind that when you are designing or creating a web application, then you should be able to handle all of the browsers, or at least most of them. If you are not providing support for any set of browser versions, then state it explicitly for your users so that they can update their browsers to be able to use your application. So now when this XML HTTP object has been created, then what we will do is we will simply open up a new GET request. So XML HTTP dot open, and this is going to be a GET request. For the path of the resource, we are going to provide the value of the root object's template property, which is holding the path of the view HTML file. So root object dot template, and that's it. Finally, we will need to send this request, but we will also need to provide a callback function to fetch the results. And for that, what I will do is XML HTTP dot on ready state change equals to function, and then we will need to check the value of the ready state property and the status property. So if the ready state value is 4 and the status is 200, it means that the request has been successful. So we can now load the view, and to load the view we will need to create another function, because in that function we will be calling the controller function, and then we will be replacing the tokens from the view HTML. So let's do that. Function load view, and this load view function is again going to accept a couple of arguments. The first one is going to be the root object, the second one is going to be the view element, and then we will also need the view HTML on which it will work. In this load view function, we will do a number of things. The first one is create the model object and then call the controller function of the root. After this, we will need to replace the view HTML tokens with the model properties. Finally, we will render the view, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so to create the initial model object, we will simply create a new object and let's call it model, and that's it. Now to call the controller function, we will use the root object. So root object dot controller, this is a function, and then we will provide the model object as an argument so that the controller function can attach new properties to this object. And then we will need to replace the tokens, and to replace the tokens we will create a new function, because it is better to put all of these specific functionalities in new functions so that they are easier to manage. So for that, let's create a new function and let's call it replace tokens. This replace tokens function is going to accept two arguments. The first one is the view HTML, and then we will need the model object whose properties we will be accessing. Now the first thing which we will do is we will get the list of all the properties which have been added to the model object by the controller function. This will be done by using the object.getOnPropertyNames, and this will return a list of the properties which have been added to it. Now we will iterate over all of these properties. We will match the property names with the values of the tokens, and if a match is found, then we will replace the token with the value of the property. So this is how it will be done. For each of the model properties, we will be replacing the token which is matching the current element with the value of that property in the model object. It's pretty simple to look at. If you have any confusion, then you can take a look at the source code later after watching this video, or if you have more questions, then you can simply ask them in the comments area. And finally, we will need to return the view HTML, And that's all about the replace token functions. Now we will simply call these functions over here, replace tokens, and then we will provide the view HTML and the model arguments. Now it's time to render the view. So what we will do is we will first check if the underscore rendered flag is false, because if the view has already been rendered, then we don't have to render it again by replacing the view elements contents with the view HTML. If it is not rendered, then we will simply replace the view elements inner HTML. Actually, they should all be in caps. So with the view HTML, and let's also set the rendered flag to true. And that's pretty much it. Now the last thing that we need to do here is to attach our plugin with the window. This can be done by adding this plugin as a property to the window. So JS MVC equals to new, and then let's call the constructor function. And that's it. So I guess we are finally done coding our plugin. Now this may prove to be a bit complex for many people who are not aware with some of the basics and some of the concepts which have been used over here, but I hope that after all of these steps and comments, this should be simple for you guys. Okay, and we also need to render the view HTML, right? So we are not yet finished, because when the update view will be called, then we will have to fetch the view HTML as a last step. This can be done by simply calling this LoadTemplate function and providing it the arguments that it needs, which are the root object and the reference to the view element. And let's see if we have missed anything else. Yep, we also need to load the view from over here, and to do that we will simply call the LoadView function and we will provide the necessary arguments. So the load view needs the root object, which we have provided over here, the view element and the view HTML. Now the view HTML is going to be the response text property of this XML HTTP object. If the request has been successfully made, then the contents of the HTML file will be in this response text property, which will eventually be supplied as an argument to this load view function. Now it's time to see if this code is working or not. If it's not, then we will see what the errors are. Hopefully there will be none. What I will do is I will replace the reference of this mvc.js with the new mvc1.js which we just created, and I will use the live server extension to run this page in its own server. Okay, so let's see in the browser if it's working or not. So this is the index.html. The views are switching, but the tokens are not being replaced, and we will need to see why this is happening. So the problem over here is we have called the replace tokens functions, but this replace tokens function is actually returning the updated view HTML. So what we will do is we will simply set the view HTML with the updated one, and this should be enough to get the code working. And the live server has automatically refreshed the page. You can see that the token values are being replaced with the values which are in the model properties. The contact root is working, the about is working. Now if I will remove this, then let's see what will happen. The default root is being fetched. If I will use an incorrect view, like let's say admin, then again the default view will be kicking in because this root is not available in the root map object. And that's how we can create our own small MVC framework plugin. It's simple, right? So that is all there is to see and learn in this video, guys. I really hope that you have understood what I am trying to explain over here. Obviously, if you have any questions or suggestions, then feel free to use the comments area. Also, if you like this video and you think that this video has helped you, then don't be shy and subscribe to this channel, and also click on the bell icon if you want to receive the notifications of the new updates whenever they are available. I will see you in the next one. Till then, have a great day.